They keep asking me to explain what it was like serving under him, what it was like watching Ben Solo become Kylo Ren, and then watching Kylo Ren become something else, something that oscillated between identities so rapidly that sometimes I couldn't tell which version I was addressing when he issued orders or when his presence filled the command deck of the finalizer with that cold pressure that made breathing difficult and thinking dangerous. My name is Lieutenant Armitage Welk, and I served as a junior tactical officer aboard Supreme Leader Snoke's flagship for 3 years before transferring to Kylo Ren's personal command structure, and what I witnessed during those years doesn't fit into the neat categories that First Order intelligence wants for their psychological profiles and threat assessments. Doesn't reduce to simple narratives about dark side corruption or light side redemption. Doesn't make sense except as a kind of sustained agony, a man being pulled apart by incompatible gravitational forces while trying to maintain enough coherence to function as a military commander and Sith successor. I'm writing this from a medical bay on a resistance cruiser where they're treating me for what the doctors call acute stress response, and what I know is something worse, something that happens when you spend too long in proximity to someone whose identity is fragmenting in real time, whose internal war bleeds into the space around them until everyone nearby starts experiencing their own version of the disintegration. I first encountered Kylo Ren on the Finalizer's command deck during a briefing about resistance activity in the Outer Rim. 6 months after the destruction of Starkiller Base, and my initial impression was of someone who was trying very hard to project absolute certainty while radiating fundamental doubt, someone whose body language suggested confidence but whose presence in the Force, even to someone like me with minimal sensitivity, felt like standing near a reactor that was cycling between stable operation and critical overload. He was tall, wrapped in those black robes that consciously imitated Vader's silhouette, his face hidden behind the mask that everyone knew was affectation rather than necessity, and he moved through the assembled officers with the kind of deliberate intimidation that suggested he had studied exactly how his grandfather created fear, and was attempting to replicate those techniques without fully understanding their foundation. When he spoke, his voice was filtered through the mask's vocoder, made artificially deep and threatening, but you could hear underneath it the voice of someone younger, someone who hadn't yet grown into the authority he was claiming, and that gap between performance and reality created a cognitive dissonance that made him more unsettling than if he had simply been what he pretended to be. The briefing concerned a resistance cell on Vardos that had been interfering with First Order supply lines, and Kylo Ren listened to the tactical analysis without visible reaction before ordering a response that seemed disproportionate to the actual threat. Complete orbital bombardment followed by ground occupation and systematic interrogation of all surviving civilians. General Hux argued that such a response would strain resources and create martyrs that resistance propaganda could exploit. And I watched Ren's posture shift slightly, watched his hands curl into fists, watched the air around him seem to darken or compress or somehow become more dense, and then Hux was choking, lifted off his feet by invisible force, gasping for air that wouldn't come, while Ren stood perfectly still and said in that filtered voice, "I will not tolerate contradiction. The resistance will learn that opposition carries costs they cannot afford to pay." He released Hux after maybe 10 seconds, let him collapse to the deck coughing and humiliated, and continued the briefing as though nothing had happened, as though casual violence against his own officers was normal and acceptable and just another tool in the arsenal of command. I should have requested a transfer immediately, should have recognized that serving under someone that unstable would eventually lead to exactly the kind of psychological damage I'm experiencing now. But I was ambitious in the stupid way that young officers are ambitious, believing that proximity to power would accelerate my career, that surviving in Kylo Ren's command structure would mark me as someone capable of handling extreme stress and complex political dynamics. So I stayed, accepted my assignment as one of Ren's tactical coordinators, and began the process of learning to function in an environment where the commanding officer's emotional state could shift from calculated calm to explosive rage within seconds, where his orders sometimes contradicted themselves because they emerged from different aspects of his fractured identity, where success meant anticipating which version of him you were dealing with at any given moment and adjusting your behavior accordingly. The Vardos operation proceeded as he ordered, the orbital bombardment reducing the primary settlement to ruins and the subsequent occupation resulting in over 200 civilian casualties during interrogations that Ren personally supervised. I monitored the operation from the finalizer, tracking troop movements and resistance patterns, and I listened to the audio feeds from the interrogation sites, where Ren was extracting information through methods that combined technological torture with force-based psychological manipulation. And what struck me wasn't the brutality, which was consistent with First-Order doctrine, but the inconsistency in his approach, the way he would shift between cold efficiency and personal fury depending on what the prisoners said or didn't say, the way certain responses seemed to trigger something in him that transformed tactical interrogation into something that looked uncomfortably like self-punishment projected onto others. There was one particular prisoner, a woman named Iden Versio, who had been part of an Imperial Special Forces unit before defecting to the rebellion decades earlier, and when Ren interrogated her, the audio feed captured something I wasn't supposed to hear, something that revealed the instability at his core. She was resisting his force probe, maintaining her mental defenses with the kind of training that suggested extensive experience with Jedi techniques, and he was escalating his pressure, pouring more power into the invasion of her consciousness. And then she said something that stopped him completely, said, "You're just like your mother, pretending you've chosen a side when really you're just running from the choice." And the audio went silent for almost 30 seconds, no sounds except breathing, heavy and irregular breathing that suggested hyperventilation or panic, and then Ren screamed, an inarticulate sound of rage or anguish or both, and the next sound was the lightsaber activation, and then nothing except static because he had destroyed the recording equipment, along with everything else in the interrogation cell, including Versio herself. He returned to the finalizer 3 hours later, and I was assigned to debrief him on the tactical results of the operation, which meant standing in his personal quarters while he removed the mask and revealed the face underneath. Ben Solo's face, younger than I expected, marked with exhaustion and something that might have been regret or might have been fury. It was impossible to distinguish. He asked for casualty figures and resource expenditure and strategic assessment of whether the Vardos operation would deter other resistance cells or inspire retaliation, and I provided the data as clinically as possible, trying to maintain professional distance. But I kept noticing his hands, how they trembled slightly when he thought I wasn't watching, how he kept touching his face like he was checking to make sure it was still there, still his own face rather than something else. When I finished the briefing, he dismissed me without comment. But as I reached the door, he said something that I'm still trying to interpret. "Do you know what it's like to be expected to become someone you're not? To have everyone project their vision of who you should be onto you until you can't remember who you actually are?" I didn't answer because the question seemed rhetorical or maybe dangerous, and I left him there alone in quarters that felt too cold, that smelled faintly of ozone and something organic that might have been fear sweat or might have been my own. The pattern repeated over the following months. Operations conducted with excessive force followed by periods where Ren isolated himself in his quarters or in the meditation chamber he had constructed in the finalizer's lower decks. A space that was always too cold and too quiet, and that left everyone who entered it feeling diminished somehow, feeling like they had been measured and found insufficient. I coordinated 17 separate tactical operations under his command, and every one of them exhibited the same characteristics: initial planning that was methodical and strategically sound, execution that started controlled but escalated into personal violence that exceeded mission parameters, an aftermath where Ren retreated into himself and emerged hours or days later, seeming somehow different, like he had resolved something or given up on something or made a decision that immediately reversed itself. His presence became predictive. You could tell which version of him was active by how the air felt when he entered a room. Whether the cold pressure increased gradually or suddenly, whether his movements were controlled or barely restrained, whether his voice through the mask sounded confident or desperate. I started having dreams during this period, dreams where I was Ben Solo standing in the Jedi temple Luke Skywalker had built, standing there in the moment before everything burned, feeling the weight of expectations and the pressure of legacy, and the absolute certainty that I would fail no matter which choice I made, that I was predetermined to disappoint everyone who had invested hope in my potential. The dreams felt too vivid to be just dreams, too specific in their details, and I began to suspect that Ren's Force presence was leaking into the people around him, that his internal conflict was becoming ambient, infecting the crew with fragments of his psychological fragmentation. Other officers reported similar experiences, hallucinations of alternative lives, moments of identity confusion, sudden emotional shifts that didn't correspond to any external stimulus. The ship's medical officer documented 17 cases of dissociative episodes among command personnel in a 3-month period, a statistical anomaly that he couldn't explain through normal stress factors. And when he presented his findings to General Hux, the report was classified, and the medical officer was transferred to a penal facility in the unknown regions where problems disappeared into bureaucratic silence. Supreme Leader Snoke visited the finalizer periodically during this time, his holographic presence dominating the throne room, while Ren knelt before him receiving instructions and criticism and what sounded like deliberate psychological manipulation designed to deepen his commitment to the dark side. I was present for one of these audiences, standing with other senior officers along the chamber's perimeter, while Snoke berated Ren for his failure to locate the resistance base, for his inability to embrace his full power, for his continuing attachment to his past identity. "You are no Vader," Snoke said, his distorted voice echoing through the chamber. "You are a child in a mask playing at the dark, clinging to sentiment when you should be transcending it. Until you kill the past completely, until you destroy every remnant of Ben Solo, you will remain weak, divided, capable of achieving your destiny." And I watched Ren absorb this criticism without visible response, watched him maintain his kneeling position while his hands clenched tight enough that I could see tremors running through his arms, and I understood that Snoke's strategy was to create exactly the kind of internal conflict that was already consuming Ren, to push him toward an impossible standard that required self-annihilation as the price of acceptance. After the audience, Ren emerged from the throne room and walked directly to the nearest viewport, stood there staring out at the hyperspace tunnel we were traveling through, and I followed him because I was supposed to debrief him on pending operations, but also because something about his posture suggested he needed someone to witness whatever was happening to him, needed confirmation that he still existed as something other than Snoke's disappointment or Vader's failed successor. I approached carefully, announced my presence, and he turned to face me with an expression that looked like someone drowning, someone going under for the final time while still trying to maintain the pretense that everything was under control. "He wants me to kill her," Ren said, and I didn't have to ask who he meant, because there was only one person whose existence created that kind of conflict in him. He says that until I eliminate Leia Organa, until I personally destroy my mother, I'll never be free of the light side's influence, never complete my transformation. But if I do it, if I actually kill her, what will be left? Who will I be if I murder the person who still believes I can come back? I didn't know how to answer that, didn't have the psychological training or philosophical framework to address a question about identity murder and matricide and the cost of choosing between incompatible loyalties. So I gave him the tactical briefing instead, focused on operational details and strategic priorities, gave him something concrete to think about that didn't require engaging with the impossible choice Snoke had presented. But even as I was talking, I could see him fragmenting in real time, could see the mask of certainty dissolving to reveal the confusion underneath. And I understood that I was watching someone fail at the most fundamental level, failing to maintain coherent selfhood while being pulled toward two equally impossible versions of who he might become. The crisis accelerated after the destruction of the Supremacy, after Snoke's death and Ren's sudden elevation to Supreme Leader, after his confrontation with Luke Skywalker on Crate, where whatever remained of his connection to his past was apparently severed or transformed or driven deeper underground. He returned to the finalizer changed, harder somehow, but also more unstable, his presence radiating an intensity that felt like exposure to radiation, something that damaged you on a cellular level just by proximity. He had killed Snoke, had seized power through violence, had declared himself supreme leader of the First Order, and he was convinced that this act of patricide had freed him from his divided nature, had finally allowed him to commit fully to the dark side and eliminate the weakness of doubt. But I could see in his eyes, in the moments when he removed the mask, that nothing had been resolved, that killing Snoke had just created new internal conflicts, new doubts about whether he had made the right choice or just destroyed the last structure that was holding him together. He became obsessed with finding Rey during this period, the scavenger girl from Jakku who had somehow resisted his Force interrogation and defeated him in lightsaber combat, and who represented something he couldn't articulate, but that clearly disturbed him at a fundamental level. He issued orders to prioritize her capture above all other strategic objectives, diverted resources from critical military operations to pursue intelligence about her location, and spent hours in his meditation chamber focused on some kind of Force connection with her that I didn't fully understand, but that left him drained and sometimes visibly shaking. Other officers speculated about the nature of his interest, whether it was strategic or personal or something else, and I kept my theories private because voicing them would have meant acknowledging what was obvious to anyone paying attention. Ren saw in Rey some alternative version of himself, someone who had power but hadn't been corrupted by it, someone who had chosen the light despite having every reason to embrace the dark, and her existence challenged everything he was trying to believe about the inevitability of his own corruption. I was present on the bridge when he communicated with her through the Force, when whatever connection they shared manifested strongly enough that he seemed to be having a conversation with someone invisible, responding to statements the rest of us couldn't hear, arguing with someone who wasn't physically present. It was deeply unsettling to watch, his posture shifting between aggression and something that looked like pleading, his voice alternating between commanding and desperate, and when the connection ended, he stood there silent for almost 5 minutes before noticing that the entire bridge crew was staring at him. He ordered us back to our stations without explanation, retreated to his quarters, and I received reports later that he had destroyed most of the furniture in there, had torn apart the meditation chamber with his lightsaber, had been heard screaming something about lies and choices and impossible expectations. The dreams intensified during this period, became more invasive and specific, and I started experiencing them while awake. Sudden, intrusive visions of moments from Ben Solo's childhood that I had no way of knowing about, standing in front of Han Solo and Leia Organa as they argued about his force training, feeling their fear of his power and his fear of their fear, feeling the fundamental loneliness of being someone whose nature frightened the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. I saw him at Luke's temple, saw the moment when Luke stood over him with activated lightsaber, saw the terror and betrayal that transformed into rage and destruction, saw how that single moment of perceived threat collapsed every possible future into the narrow path he had been walking ever since. I saw him with Snoke, saw years of manipulation and praise withheld, and affection conditional on complete submission to the dark side, saw how every moment of vulnerability was weaponized and every expression of doubt was punished, until doubt itself became the enemy, until certainty was the only acceptable emotional state, regardless of whether that certainty was genuine. These visions weren't just memories. They felt like I was experiencing them directly, like Ren's force presence was overwhelming the boundaries between individual consciousness and creating some kind of shared psychological space where his past became accessible to everyone in proximity. Other officers reported similar experiences, all of us gradually accumulating pieces of his history without consent or control, all of us becoming involuntary witnesses to his internal war. The ship's atmosphere changed, became oppressive in ways that weren't just about military hierarchy or first-order authoritarianism, but about something more fundamental, about being trapped in close quarters with someone whose identity was dissolving and whose dissolution was contagious. I requested a transfer after 6 months, serving under Ren as Supreme Leader, submitted the paperwork through proper channels with appropriate justifications about career development and skill utilization, and the request was denied without explanation. I tried again 2 months later, and the response was more explicit. Personnel assigned to Supreme Leader Ren's command structure were considered critical assets who could not be reassigned without his personal authorization, and he had indicated that he wanted to maintain continuity in his tactical coordination team. I was trapped, locked into serving someone whose presence was actively damaging my psychological stability, and I understood that this was intentional, that Ren recognized what was happening to his command staff and either didn't care or actively wanted us damaged because our damage reflected his own, because creating a crew of fragmented people meant he wasn't alone in his disintegration. The Battle of Exegol changed everything, or maybe it just made explicit what had been building for years. The final revelation of the impossible choice Ren had been trying to avoid since the moment he destroyed Luke's temple and committed himself to becoming Kylo Ren. I wasn't present for the actual confrontation, was coordinating tactical operations from the finalizer, while Ren descended to the Sith Eternal Facility to meet Emperor Palpatine and Rey, but I was monitoring all communications channels, and I heard fragments of what transpired there. Heard Palpatine offering Ren ultimate power in exchange for killing the girl. Heard Rey calling him Ben and begging him to come back. Heard the moment when whatever decision he made manifested as a shift in the Force so powerful that even I felt it, felt something fundamental change, like a reactor reaching critical mass and choosing containment instead of explosion. The communications from Exegol went silent after that, all channels going dark, and I stood on the bridge waiting for orders that didn't come, watching the holographic tactical display show First Order forces engaging resistance ships, while our supreme leader remained unresponsive. General Pride assumed command, ordered the fleet to continue prosecution of the battle, and I kept monitoring the dead channels, hoping for some indication of what had happened to Ren, whether he had survived or been killed or achieved whatever transformation he had been spiraling toward for years. The battle turned against us when the civilian fleet arrived, thousands of ships responding to the resistance call for help, and I watched our tactical advantage collapse in real time as overwhelming numbers compensated for inferior weapons and training. Watched the First Order's decades of preparation and resource investment dissolve into desperate retreat as the resistance became something larger than we could suppress. I survived the battle by abandoning ship when it became clear the finalizer was going to be destroyed, escaped on a personnel transport that made it to hyperspace before the Star Destroyer suffered catastrophic reactor failure, and I drifted for 3 days in an escape pod before a resistance patrol found me and brought me here, to this medical bay where they keep asking questions I don't know how to answer about Kylo Ren's strategic planning and First Order command structure and tactical capabilities. But what they really want to know, what they keep circling back to despite their clinical language and intelligence protocols, is who he was, really, beneath the mask and performance and Vader imitation, whether Ben Solo still existed inside Kylo Ren or whether the transformation was complete and irreversible. I tell them what I observed, describe the oscillation between identities, explain how he seemed to be fighting a war with himself that was more intense and destructive than his war against the resistance, and they record everything and thank me and then ask the same questions again, in slightly different language, like they're hoping I'll reveal some detail that makes the whole thing coherent. But there is no coherent version of Kylo Ren, no simple narrative that explains how Ben Solo became someone else and then became Ben Solo again, if that's what actually happened at Exegol. If the reports are accurate that he helped Rey defeat Palpatine before dying there on that dark planet in the unknown regions. All I know is what I witnessed during my time serving under him. A man being torn apart by incompatible expectations and impossible choices. Someone who was trying to become Vader without understanding that Vader himself had been destroyed by the same internal war. Someone who thought that killing his past would free him, but who found instead that the past couldn't be killed because it was constitutive of identity itself. Because you can't destroy who you were without destroying who you are, because the self is continuous, or it's nothing at all. The resistance therapist assigned to my case keeps suggesting that I'm experiencing transferred trauma, that my proximity to Ren's force presence created a kind of psychological contamination where his internal conflicts became partially mine, where the boundaries between his identity crisis and my own stability dissolved enough that I absorbed pieces of his fragmentation. She says this like it's a diagnosis that will lead to treatment, like understanding the mechanism of damage will help me heal. But I don't think she understands that some damage is permanent, that spending years in proximity to someone whose identity is dissolving changes you in ways that can't be reversed through therapy or time or distance. I dream about him still, dream about standing at that viewport on the finalizer, staring out at hyperspace while trying to decide which version of myself to be, which impossible choice to make when every option leads to some form of annihilation. They tell me that Ben Solo died saving Rey, that his final act was to give his life force to resurrect her after Palpatine's attack, that he chose at the very end to embrace the light side completely and sacrifice himself for someone else's survival. They tell me this like it's a redemption story, like it erases or justifies or makes meaningful the years of atrocities he committed as Kylo Ren, the people he killed, and the terror he spread, and the psychological damage he inflicted, on everyone who served under him. But I can't see it that simply. Can't reduce his death to redemptive sacrifice without acknowledging that he spent years trying to become someone terrible, that he committed horrible acts in service of an identity he was trying to convince himself was authentic, that his internal war left casualties long before his final choice at Exegol. I think about his question sometimes, the one he asked me after Snoke's audience. Do you know what it's like to be expected to become someone you're not? I understand now that it wasn't rhetorical, that he was asking genuinely whether anyone else experienced the specific torture of having your identity be a battleground where other people's expectations and projections and fears competed for dominance until you couldn't locate your own genuine preferences beneath the layers of imposed meaning. He was asking whether anyone else felt like they were performing selfhood rather than experiencing it, whether anyone else looked in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing their face, whether anyone else felt the constant pressure of choosing between equally impossible versions of who they might become. I don't have an answer for him now any more than I did then, but I understand the question in a way I didn't when he asked it. Understand it because serving under him taught me what it feels like to have your identity become unstable, to lose certainty about who you are and what you believe, and which version of yourself is authentic versus which is performance for survival. The Resistance wants me to testify about first-order operations, wants me to help them understand the command structure and strategic planning and tactical capabilities that defined our military operations. And I cooperate because I'm a prisoner with no better options, and because part of me wants the First Order destroyed, wants the system that created Kylo Ren eliminated so that no one else has to experience what he experienced or what I experienced watching him disintegrate. But another part of me, the part that absorbed too much of his presence during those years of service, understands that destroying the First Order won't eliminate the fundamental problem that created him, won't address the question of what happens when someone is born into a legacy too large to carry, when they're expected to become either a perfect Jedi or a perfect Sith, when neither category fits their actual nature, when every choice they make is interpreted through the framework of other people's needs and fears and projections, until their authentic self becomes invisible even to them. Ben Solo was destroyed by that pressure long before he became Kylo Ren, destroyed by being Han and Leia's son and Luke's student and Vader's grandson, destroyed by having his identity be constituted entirely by relationships to powerful people who couldn't see him as himself, rather than as a symbol of their hopes or failures. Kylo Ren was his attempt to escape that destruction by becoming someone else entirely, by embracing darkness and power and certainty in ways that would make him illegible to the people who thought they knew him, that would finally give him an identity that was his own choice rather than inheritance or expectation. But that attempt failed because you can't escape yourself through transformation, can't become someone new by killing who you were, can't resolve internal conflict through external violence no matter how much destruction you inflict on the galaxy around you. He learned that too late, learned it only in the moment of his death when he finally stopped trying to be either Ben Solo or Kylo Ren, and just acted according to what he actually wanted rather than what he thought he should want. Saved Rey because he cared about her survival more than he cared about fulfilling his destiny as Supreme Leader or Dark Side Master or Vader's successor. The medical staff says I'm recovering, that my psychological assessments show improvement, that the intrusive memories and identity confusion are diminishing as I establish distance from the finalizer and the First Order and Kylo Ren's presence. They say this like it's straightforward healing, like trauma has a recovery timeline that can be charted and predicted, but I know better because I can still feel him sometimes, still sense that cold pressure that meant he was nearby. still hear fragments of his thoughts bleeding into my consciousness, like our proximity created permanent channels between his mind and mine. I dream about him standing at that viewport, dream about the tremor in his hands when he removed his mask, dream about the moment when he asked whether anyone else understood what it was like to be expected to become someone you're not. And I wake up uncertain whether I'm dreaming his memories or my own, whether I'm Armitage Welk or some fragment of Ben Solo that got lodged in my consciousness during the years I spent watching him fragment. The resistance therapist says that's normal, that trauma creates confusion between self and other, that I'm experiencing a kind of identification with my traumatizer that will resolve as I process the experience and reclaim my sense of autonomous identity. But I think she's wrong. Think that what happened to me was more fundamental than trauma. Think that serving under Kylo Ren meant experiencing something that the Resistance doesn't have framework or language to understand. The Force as contagion, identity as permeable, the self as something that can be invaded and colonized and fundamentally altered by prolonged exposure to someone whose presence in the Force is powerful enough to overwhelm psychological boundaries. I'm not recovering from trauma. I'm recovering from having been partially someone else for 3 years, from having shared headspace with someone whose internal war was intense enough to drag other people into it, and I don't know if recovery from that is even possible, or if I'll spend the rest of my life navigating between versions of myself that don't quite cohere into a stable identity. They tell me Ben Solo is dead, that Kylo Ren is gone, that the war is over and I'm safe now, free from the First Order and the darkness and the constant pressure of serving under someone who was actively disintegrating. They tell me this like it should be comforting, like the source of my trauma being eliminated means the trauma itself will fade. But I can't feel relief because I keep thinking about that final choice at Exegol, about him deciding at the very end to be Ben Solo completely, to embrace the light and save Rey and die as himself rather than as the person he had been trying to become. I keep thinking that maybe he finally found the answer to his question, finally understood that you can't be expected to become someone you're not, that the only authentic choice is to be who you actually are, regardless of whether that fulfills anyone else's expectations or fits into their narrative about who you should be. But that realization cost him everything, cost him his identity as supreme leader and his power in the dark side and, ultimately, his life. And I wonder whether that price is inevitable, whether anyone who gets trapped between incompatible destinies the way he was trapped can ever escape except through death, whether the only way to resolve that kind of fundamental internal conflict is to stop existing as the person who contains the conflict. I don't have an answer to that. Don't know whether Ben Solo's death at Exegol was redemption or tragedy or just the final consequence of impossible choices made years earlier when he destroyed Luke's temple and committed himself to becoming someone he could never quite manage to be. What I know is that I served under Kylo Ren for 3 years and watched him spiral between identities that were both incomplete, both inadequate to contain the complexity of who he actually was. And that spiral consumed him and nearly consumed me and left damage that I'm still trying to map and understand. What I know is that the galaxy will remember him as a villain or a martyr or a cautionary tale depending on who's telling the story. But none of those simple narratives will capture what it was like to watch someone fight a war with themselves that was more brutal and destructive than any external conflict, to witness identity disintegrate in real time, while the person experiencing that disintegration tried desperately to maintain enough coherence to function as a military commander and Sith successor and human being. The Resistance wants me to help them understand the First Order's tactical capabilities and strategic planning, wants me to contribute to their effort to eliminate the remaining Imperial remnants and build something better than what came before. I cooperate because I have no better options, and because part of me believes in their vision of a galaxy free from tyranny and oppression, and the kind of systematic dehumanization that the First Order represented. But another part of me, the part that absorbed too much of Kylo Ren's presence during those years of service, knows that eliminating the First Order won't address the deeper problem that created him, won't prevent other Ben Solos from being crushed by impossible expectations and incompatible destinies, won't solve the question of what happens when someone is born into a legacy so heavy that it prevents them from discovering who they might have been if they had been permitted to be themselves. I think about him standing at that viewport, staring into hyperspace, asking whether anyone understood what it felt like to be expected to become someone you're not. And I wish I had answered him then, wish I had said, yes, I understand, we all understand, because we're all performing versions of ourselves that don't quite match our internal reality. We're all navigating between who we are and who we're supposed to be, and trying to find some accommodation that doesn't destroy us in the process. But I didn't say that, didn't give him the answer he was looking for, and now he's dead, and I'm here trying to recover from 3 years of shared psychological space with someone whose internal war was intense enough to damage everyone in proximity. The medical staff says I'm making progress, that the boundary between my memories and his intrusive presence is becoming clearer, that eventually I'll reclaim full autonomy over my own consciousness and identity. They say this like it's certain, like healing is inevitable given enough time and proper therapeutic intervention. But I'm not convinced because I still feel him sometimes, still sense that cold pressure that meant he was nearby, still hear fragments of his question echoing through my thoughts. Do you know what it's like to be expected to become someone you're not? And I realize that I'll probably be answering that question for the rest of my life, trying to articulate what I witnessed during those 3 years, serving under someone who was trapped between 2 destinies, and who finally chose to stop being trapped by choosing death over continued performance, by giving his life to save someone rather than continuing to fight a war he could never win. That's the twisted spiral of Kylo Ren, the path between 2 destinies that ultimately led nowhere except to death and damage, and a question that remains unanswered. What happens when you're born into a legacy you can't fulfill and can't escape, when every version of yourself is inadequate to someone's expectations, when the only authentic choice is to stop choosing and let the spiral collapse into whatever comes next? Ben Solo answered that question with his final act at Exegol, answered it by stopping being either Ben Solo or Kylo Ren, and just being someone who saved the person he cared about, regardless of what that choice cost him. I don't know if that's redemption or just exhaustion. Don't know if his death redeems his years as Kylo Ren or simply ends them. Don't know whether the galaxy is better for his existence or would have been better if he had never been born into the impossible position of being heir to both the light and the dark. What I know is that I survived serving under him, survived 3 years of shared psychological space with someone whose identity was fragmenting, and that survival has left me changed in ways I'm still discovering, still trying to understand, still learning to navigate. The resistance therapist says that change is temporary, that I'll eventually return to my baseline personality and recover full stability, but I think she's wrong because some changes are permanent. Some exposures leave marks that never fully fade. Some questions lodge in your consciousness and transform how you understand identity and choice and the cost of trying to become someone you're not. Kylo Ren taught me that, taught me through his presence and his disintegration and his final choice at Exegol, and I'll carry that lesson for whatever remains of my life, A reminder that the self is more fragile than we pretend, that identity can be broken by expectations and trauma, and the impossible weight of other people's projections, that sometimes the only escape from a twisted spiral between incompatible destinies is to stop spiraling and accept whatever comes next, even if what comes next is death.